Number, he missed his flight and saved a child, then realized it was his own son. The moment Daniel Carter's life shattered into 1,000 pieces began with the sound of metal crushing bone. He had exactly 4 seconds to choose between catching his flight to the most important meeting of his career or diving headfirst into the path of a runaway baggage cart to save a stranger's child. Time slowed to a crawl as he watched the small boy tumble from the moving walkway, his tiny body rolling directly toward 2 tons of steel and spinning wheels. The child's terrified eyes locked onto Daniel's through the chaos, and in that split second of pure terror, something primal roared to life in Daniel's chest. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He simply launched himself forward like a missile, his body colliding with the boy just as the cart thundered past where the child's head had been milliseconds before. As they rolled to safety in a tangle of limbs, Daniel found himself staring into the most familiar blue eyes he had ever seen. Eyes that looked exactly like his own. Eyes that belonged to the son he never knew existed. The mechanical whir of the moving walkway beneath his feet seemed to mock his urgency as Daniel spotted gate C-23 in the distance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the Boeing 737 still connected to the jet bridge, but the gate area was nearly empty. His chest tightened with dread as he approached the counter where a uniformed airline employee was gathering papers. "Excuse me," Daniel called out, slightly out of breath. "Is there any way I can still make this flight?" The gate agent looked up with practiced sympathy, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but we've already closed the boarding door. The aircraft is preparing for pushback." Daniel felt his shoulders slump in defeat. This wasn't just any flight. He was supposed to meet with a potential client who could change everything for his struggling engineering consulting firm. More than that, he was finally going to visit his old friend Mike, who had been battling cancer and asking to see him for months. As Daniel stood there watching his plane taxi away from the gate, a commotion erupted near the baggage carousel area below. A child's terrified scream cut through the ambient noise of the airport, followed by shouts from several adults. Without thinking, Daniel dropped his briefcase and ran toward the escalator that led down to the baggage claim. What he saw made his blood run cold. A small boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, had somehow fallen off the moving walkway and was now dangerously close to the massive rotating carousel where heavy suitcases tumbled onto the belt. The child seemed disoriented, possibly hurt, and was crawling directly into the path of an enormous black trunk that was sliding down the chute. Daniel took the escalator steps 3 at a time, his mind calculating trajectories and timing with the precision that had made him a skilled engineer. He reached the bottom just as the trunk began its descent toward the boy. In one fluid motion, Daniel lunged forward and scooped the child into his arms, rolling them both away from the carousel, just as the heavy luggage crashed onto the belt where the boy had been moments before. For several seconds, they lay on the polished airport floor, Daniel's arms wrapped protectively around the small form, both of them breathing heavily from the adrenaline rush. "Are you okay, buddy?" Daniel asked softly, loosening his grip to look at the child's face. What he saw made his world tilt on its axis. The boy had the most striking blue eyes Daniel had ever seen, the exact shade of his own, framed by dark brown hair that fell in waves across his forehead. But it wasn't just the coloring that made Daniel's breath catch. It was the shape of the nose, the curve of the jawline, even the way the boy's eyebrows furrowed in concentration as he tried to process what had just happened. "I think so," the child said in a small voice, and even his speech pattern seemed familiar to Daniel. The careful way he formed his words, the slight lisp on the letters. Before Daniel could process this strange recognition fully, a woman's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife through his heart. "Ethan! Oh my God! Ethan! Are you hurt?" Daniel looked up to see a woman running toward them, her long auburn hair streaming behind her, her green eyes wide with terror and relief. Laura. After 8 years, she looked almost exactly the same, perhaps a little thinner, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and responsibility, but still heartbreakingly beautiful. She dropped to her knees beside them, her hands shaking as she reached for the boy, Ethan, checking him for injuries with the practiced efficiency of a mother. "I'm okay, Mommy," Ethan said, though he remained curled against Daniel's chest, seemingly reluctant to leave the safety of his arms. "This man saved me from the big suitcase." Laura's eyes finally met Daniel's, and he saw the exact moment recognition dawned in her features. The color drained from her face, and her hands stilled on Ethan's shoulders. "Daniel," she whispered, his name barely audible above the noise of the airport. They stared at each other across the span of 8 years, across all the words left unsaid and the choices that had driven them apart. Daniel felt as if he were drowning in memories. Laura's laugh echoing through his small apartment, the way she used to curl up against him while reading her medical textbooks, the morning he woke up to find her side of the bed cold and a note on the kitchen counter saying she couldn't do this anymore. He had been 28 then, ambitious and driven, working 18-hour days to build his consulting firm from nothing. Laura had been in her final year of nursing school, stressed about exams and clinicals, and Daniel had been too wrapped up in his own success to notice how much she was struggling. The fight that ended everything had been about something stupid. He couldn't even remember what, but it had escalated until they were both saying things they couldn't take back. "Thank you," Laura said finally, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Thank you for saving him." She helped Ethan to his feet, brushing dust off his small jeans and checking his scraped palms. Daniel stood up slowly, his mind racing as he studied the boy's features. Ethan looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, which would mean he was born sometime around 2015 or 2016. Daniel's heart began to pound as he did the math. He and Laura had broken up in February of 2015, but they had been together for almost 2 years before that. Could this child, this beautiful boy with Daniel's eyes and Laura's stubborn chin, possibly be his son? The thought was so overwhelming that Daniel had to steady himself against a nearby pillar. "Is he going to be okay?" Daniel asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Laura nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Yes, I think so. Just some scrapes. We should get him checked out at the medical station just to be safe." As Laura gathered their belongings, Daniel noticed details he had missed before. Ethan was wearing a small backpack decorated with airplanes, and pinned to the strap was a button that read "Future Pilot" in bold letters. The boy kept glancing up at Daniel with curiosity and something that might have been admiration. "Are you a pilot?" Ethan asked suddenly, his young voice filled with wonder. "You moved really fast, like you knew exactly what to do." Daniel knelt down to the boy's level, fighting the urge to reach out and touch his face, to trace the familiar features he was certain he recognized. "No, buddy, I'm an engineer, but I work with airplanes sometimes, helping to make sure they're safe and work properly." Ethan's eyes grew wide with excitement. "That's so cool. I love airplanes. Mommy says my daddy used to work with airplanes too, but I've never met him." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, and he had to grip the floor to keep from swaying. Laura's face had gone pale again, and she quickly took Ethan's hand. "We should really get going," Laura said hurriedly, avoiding Daniel's eyes. "Thank you again for what you did. I don't know how to repay you." Daniel stood up slowly, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't ask. Not here, not in front of the boy. "Laura, wait," he called as she started to walk away. "Could we maybe talk? I mean, it's been so long and I'd like to know how you've been." Laura paused, her back still turned to him, and Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders. When she finally turned around, her expression was guarded, protective. "I don't think that's a good idea, Daniel. We both moved on with our lives." But even as she said it, Daniel could see the conflict in her eyes, the same struggle he was feeling. Ethan tugged on his mother's hand, looking back at Daniel with obvious disappointment. "But Mommy, he's nice, and he saved me. Can't he come with us to make sure I'm really okay?" Laura's resolve seemed to waver at her son's words, and Daniel seized the opportunity. "I'd be honored to make sure he's all right," Daniel said carefully. "And maybe we could grab a coffee afterward, just to catch up?" Laura studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay, but just for a little while. Ethan needs to get home and rest." As they walked toward the airport medical station, Daniel found himself studying every aspect of the boy beside him. Ethan chattered easily about airplanes and school, and his pet hamster named Rocket, his personality bright and engaging in a way that reminded Daniel painfully of Laura. But there were other things too, mannerisms that seemed to echo Daniel's own childhood. The way Ethan tilted his head when thinking, how he gestured with his hands when excited, even his methodical approach to describing the airplane models he was building at home. Each similarity felt like another piece of a puzzle Daniel was terrified to complete. The nurse at the medical station, a kind older woman named Betty, checked Ethan thoroughly, and declared him perfectly fine, except for some minor scrapes that she cleaned and bandaged with cartoon band-aids. Throughout the examination, Daniel stood back and watched Laura with her son, marveling at the gentle efficiency with which she handled every aspect of his care. She had always been nurturing, he remembered, the type of person who rescued stray cats and volunteered at homeless shelters despite her own busy schedule. Seeing her as a mother felt both natural and heartbreaking, a glimpse into a life he might have been part of if he had been wiser, more mature, less focused on his own ambitions. "All done, sweetie," the nurse announced, giving Ethan a sticker that featured a smiling airplane. "You're one brave little man." Ethan beamed with pride and immediately showed the sticker to Daniel, as if seeking his approval. "Look, it's just like the ones you work on, right?" Daniel's throat tightened with emotion he couldn't quite name. "That's right, buddy, and you were incredibly brave today." As they left the medical station, Laura finally seemed to relax slightly, though Daniel could still sense her wariness. They found a quiet corner in one of the airport's coffee shops, away from the main flow of travelers. Ethan immediately pulled out a small tablet and began showing Daniel photos of the model airplanes he was building, his enthusiasm infectious, despite the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air. "I'm working on a Boeing 747 right now," Ethan said proudly. "It's really hard because it has so many little pieces, but Mommy says I'm good at being patient." Daniel looked at the detailed models on the screen, impressed by the precision and care evident in the boy's work. "These are remarkable, Ethan. You have a real talent for this kind of work." Laura watched this interaction with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read, something between pride and pain. "Ethan, sweetheart, why don't you go get us some napkins from the counter?" Laura suggested gently. As soon as the boy was out of earshot, Laura turned to Daniel with a look of fierce protectiveness. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly, "and I need you to understand that Ethan is my son. I've raised him alone for 8 years, and he's happy and well-adjusted, and I won't let anyone disrupt his life." Daniel felt a surge of hurt at her assumption, followed by a deeper sadness at how much distance had grown between them. "Laura, I'm not trying to disrupt anything, but I can't ignore what I'm seeing. He looks exactly like I did as a child, down to the cowlick in his hair. And the way he thinks, the way he approaches problems, it's like looking at myself 30 years ago." Laura's composure began to crack, and Daniel could see tears forming in her eyes. "Even if that were true, which I'm not saying it is, what difference would it make now? You made your choice 8 years ago, Daniel. You chose your career over everything else." The accusation stung because Daniel knew there was truth in it, but it also sparked his own frustration with how everything had fallen apart. "That's not fair, Laura. You left me, remember? You left a note and disappeared without giving me a chance to fix things." Laura's eyes flashed with old anger. "Fix things? Daniel, you worked 90 hours a week. You missed every important event in my life. My graduation from nursing school, my birthday, the dinner with my parents where I wanted to tell them we were serious about each other. You were physically present sometimes, but you were never really there." The words hit Daniel like physical blows because he remembered each of those missed occasions, each time he had promised to do better and then failed to follow through. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was selfish and immature, and I took you for granted. But if Ethan is my son, if we created a life together, don't I have a right to know?" Ethan returned with a handful of napkins, his innocent presence immediately diffusing the tension between the adults. Laura wiped her eyes quickly and smiled at her son, but Daniel could see the effort it took. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're so helpful." Ethan climbed back into his chair and looked between his mother and Daniel, with the perceptive eyes of a child who had learned to read adult emotions. "Are you sad, Mommy?" he asked with concern. "And you too, Mr. Daniel. Did I do something wrong?" Daniel's heart clenched at being called Mr. Daniel by a boy who might be his own son. "No, buddy, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings about things that happened a long time ago." Ethan nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. "Like when I'm sad about not having a daddy, but also happy that I have the best mommy in the world?" The innocent question hung in the air like a challenge, and Daniel saw Laura's face crumble slightly before she recovered her composure. "That's exactly right, sweetheart," she said softly, stroking Ethan's hair. "Sometimes we can have different feelings about the same thing." Daniel felt as if his heart was being torn in two. Here was this incredible child, bright and funny and kind, possibly his own flesh and blood, talking about missing a father while that father sat right across from him. The irony was almost unbearable. "Ethan," Daniel said carefully, "your mommy is absolutely right. She is the best mommy in the world. You're very lucky to have her." Ethan beamed at this affirmation, then looked thoughtful. "Do you have kids, Mr. Daniel?" The question Daniel had been dreading finally came, and he found himself struggling for an honest answer that wouldn't hurt anyone. "I don't know," he said finally, looking directly at Laura. "I hope so, but I'm not sure yet." After finishing their coffee, Laura announced that it was time for them to head home, and Daniel felt a desperate need to extend their time together. "Could I walk you to your car?" he asked, hating how formal and distant he sounded. Laura hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but then we really do need to say goodbye." As they walked through the airport parking garage, Ethan chattered about wanting to become a pilot when he grew up, just like Captain Murphy from his favorite television show. He asked Daniel technical questions about airplanes with the kind of focused curiosity that reminded Daniel painfully of his own childhood obsession with how things worked. Laura's car was a modest Honda Civic, clearly well-maintained, but showing its age. As she buckled Ethan into his booster seat, Daniel noticed a small collection of toy airplanes hanging from the rearview mirror, and his heart ached at this tangible evidence of the boy's dreams. "Mr. Daniel," Ethan called through the open car window, "will I see you again? I have more airplane pictures I could show you." Daniel looked at Laura, silently pleading with her to give him some hope, some chance to be part of this child's life if his suspicions were correct. Laura's expression was conflicted, torn between protecting her son and perhaps acknowledging the undeniable connections Daniel had pointed out. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said noncommittally. "Sometimes people come into our lives for just a little while, and that's okay too." Daniel felt desperation rising in his chest. He couldn't let them disappear again, not when he had so many questions that needed answers. "Laura, please, could we at least exchange phone numbers? In case Ethan has any delayed reactions from his fall today." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it, but Laura seemed to recognize the deeper plea in his voice. After a moment's hesitation, Laura pulled out her phone, and they exchanged contact information. Daniel programmed her number carefully, as if it were the most precious thing he had ever been given. "Thank you," he said simply, hoping she could hear all the things he couldn't say in front of Ethan. As they drove away, Daniel stood in the parking garage watching the taillights disappear into the Chicago evening, feeling as if his entire world had shifted on its axis. The flight he had missed suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that he had just found a son he never knew existed. That night, Daniel lay awake in his downtown apartment, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of his encounter with Ethan and Laura. He pulled up photos from his own childhood on his phone, comparing them to his memory of Ethan's face, and the similarities seemed even more striking in hindsight. The next morning, Daniel called his assistant and canceled his remaining business meetings for the week. For the first time in his career, work seemed secondary to something more important. Instead, he found himself researching everything he could about child development, trying to understand what Ethan's interests and abilities might mean about his parentage. He also found himself thinking about Laura, about the woman she had become and the life she had built without him. She had clearly thrived as a mother, raising a remarkable child with strength and grace, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that she had sacrificed her own dreams in the process. He remembered her talking about wanting to work in pediatric nursing, maybe even becoming a nurse practitioner, but the realities of single motherhood might have changed those plans. The thought that his absence might have limited her opportunities added another layer of guilt to his already complex emotions. 3 days after their encounter at the airport, Daniel worked up the courage to send Laura a text message. He kept it simple and focused on Ethan's well-being. "Hi Laura, I hope Ethan is doing well after his fall. I've been thinking about him and wanted to make sure he doesn't have any lingering effects from the scare." Laura's response came several hours later. "He's fine, thank you for asking. He's been talking about the airplane man who saved him almost non-stop." Daniel smiled at being called the airplane man and felt encouraged by Laura's relatively warm tone. He decided to take a chance. "I'd love to hear more about what he's been saying. Would you be open to meeting for lunch sometime? I promise I'm not trying to complicate your life. I just can't stop thinking about him." This time, Laura's response took almost a full day, and Daniel spent that time alternating between hope and despair, wondering if he had pushed too hard too fast. Finally, her text arrived. Ethan has been asking if he can see you again. He wants to show you his airplane collection in person. If you're genuinely interested in being kind to him, not just satisfying your own curiosity, we could meet at the Children's Museum on Saturday afternoon." Daniel's heart soared at this opportunity, and he immediately began planning what he would say, how he would approach the delicate situation of getting to know a child who might be his son. Saturday couldn't come fast enough, and Daniel found himself standing outside the Chicago Children's Museum 30 minutes early, rehearsing conversations in his head and trying to calm his nerves. When he saw Laura and Ethan approaching across the museum plaza, his breath caught in his throat. Ethan was wearing a small backpack shaped like an airplane, and he broke into a run when he spotted Daniel. "Mr. Daniel, you came! I brought my whole airplane collection to show you." The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Daniel felt some of his nervousness melt away. Laura watched their interaction carefully, and Daniel could sense her maternal instincts on high alert, ready to protect her son from any potential hurt. "I brought my camera too," Ethan announced, pulling out a small digital camera that looked like it might be several years old. "Mommy said I could take pictures of real airplanes to add to my collection." Daniel knelt down to examine Ethan's backpack full of treasures. Carefully organized model airplanes, aviation magazines with pages marked and folded, and a notebook filled with detailed drawings of aircraft from every angle. The level of focus and attention to detail was remarkable for a child Ethan's age, and it reminded Daniel powerfully of his own childhood obsessions with engineering and flight. "These are incredible, Ethan," Daniel said honestly. "You know more about airplanes than some adult pilots I've met." Ethan glowed with pride at the compliment, then looked at his mother as if seeking permission for something important. "Mommy, can I ask Mr. Daniel the question I've been thinking about?" Ethan said with the serious expression of a child who had been considering something deeply. Laura looked nervous but nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." Ethan turned back to Daniel with his piercing blue eyes, so much like Daniel's own. "Mr. Daniel, do you think my daddy would be proud of my airplane collection? Mommy says he was good with airplanes too, but she doesn't like to talk about him very much." The question hit Daniel like a physical blow, and he had to take a moment to steady himself before answering. He looked at Laura and saw tears gathering in her eyes, her protective mask slipping to reveal the pain underneath. "Ethan," Daniel said carefully, "any father would be incredibly proud of you. You're smart and kind and passionate about things you love. Those are the most important qualities a person can have." Ethan seemed satisfied with this answer and immediately launched into a detailed explanation of his latest model project, a complex military transport plane that he was building piece by piece. As they walked through the museum together, Daniel marveled at how naturally he and Ethan connected. The boy seemed to instinctively trust him, seeking his opinion on exhibits and sharing observations with the kind of openness that children usually reserved for family members. Laura watched these interactions with a mixture of wonder and worry, and Daniel could practically see the internal battle she was fighting between protecting her son and acknowledging the obvious bond forming between them. When they reached the flight simulator exhibit, Ethan's excitement reached new heights. "Can we try it, Mommy? Please? I've wanted to do this forever." Laura looked at the long line and expensive price, and Daniel could see her calculating whether this was within their budget. Without thinking, Daniel stepped forward. "I'd be honored to sponsor Ethan's first flight simulation," he said quietly to Laura. "If that's okay with you." Laura's pride flared briefly, the same independence Daniel remembered from years ago. But then she looked at her son's hopeful face, and her expression softened. "That's very generous. But you don't have to." Daniel met her eyes directly. "I want to. Please let me do this for him." After a moment's hesitation, Laura nodded, and Daniel felt a surge of gratitude that was out of proportion to the simple gesture. As Ethan climbed into the simulator cockpit, his face shining with joy, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Whether or not this boy was biologically his son, Daniel realized he was already emotionally invested in his happiness and well-being. The thought was both terrifying and wonderful, opening up possibilities for connection and love that Daniel had thought were lost to him forever. For the next hour, Daniel found himself naturally falling into a mentoring role with Ethan, explaining the basics of flight controls and navigation in terms an 8-year-old could understand. The boy absorbed every word with eager attention, asking insightful questions that revealed both natural aptitude and genuine passion for aviation. Laura stood nearby, and Daniel occasionally caught her watching him, with an expression he couldn't quite read. When Ethan's simulation time was up, he was practically vibrating with excitement. "Did you see how I made the airplane turn, Mr. Daniel? And I only crashed once." Daniel laughed at the boy's enthusiasm. "You did better than I did on my first simulation, buddy. You have real natural talent." As they prepared to leave the museum, Ethan suddenly grabbed Daniel's hand with the unconscious trust of a child. "Thank you for the best day ever, Mr. Daniel. Will you come see my airplane room at home sometime? Mommy fixed up a whole room just for my collection." Daniel looked at Laura questioningly, not wanting to assume anything about future visits. Laura seemed to struggle with the request, her protective instincts warring with her son's obvious happiness. "We'll see, Ethan," she said diplomatically. "Mr. Daniel is a very busy man." But Daniel could see something in her expression that gave him hope, perhaps a recognition that denying Ethan this connection would hurt him more than allowing it to develop. As they walked to the parking lot, Daniel's phone rang with a call from his business partner about an urgent client emergency. The old Daniel would have immediately taken the call, prioritizing work above everything else, but this time he simply declined the call and put his phone away. "Important call?" Laura asked, noticing the gesture. "Nothing more important than this," Daniel replied, meaning it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. That evening, Daniel sat in his apartment surrounded by photos he had printed from their day at the museum, studying every image of Ethan with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. In photo after photo, he saw not just physical resemblances, but expressions and gestures that seemed to echo his own childhood. There was one picture in particular, taken while Ethan was concentrating on building a model airplane at the museum's hands-on exhibit, where the resemblance was so striking that Daniel felt his breath catch. The way Ethan furrowed his brow when thinking, the precise movements of his small hands, even the way he tilted his head at exactly the same angle Daniel had seen in his own childhood photos. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but Daniel realized that what mattered more than biology was the connection he felt with this remarkable child. Whether Ethan was his biological son or not, Daniel found himself caring about his happiness and future with an intensity that surprised him. The following week, Laura surprised Daniel by texting him an invitation to Ethan's school science fair. "Ethan specifically asked if you could come," her message read. "He's presenting his project on aerodynamics, and he says you're the only adult he knows who really understands airplanes." Daniel was deeply moved by the invitation and immediately rearranged his schedule to attend. When he arrived at the elementary school gymnasium, he was struck by the sight of Ethan standing proudly beside his project display, wearing a small tie and looking both nervous and excited. The boy's project was remarkable for his age, a detailed explanation of how airplane wings create lift, complete with hand-drawn diagrams and a small wind tunnel demonstration he had built with Laura's help. "Mr. Daniel," Ethan called out when he spotted him across the room, waving enthusiastically. "Come see what I made." As Daniel examined Ethan's project, he was amazed by the depth of understanding the boy had developed. The explanations were technically accurate, but presented in a way that showed real comprehension rather than mere memorization. "This is graduate-level thinking, Ethan," Daniel said honestly. "You understand concepts that some college students struggle with." Ethan beamed with pride, then leaned closer to Daniel conspiratorially. "I had a little help from some books Mommy got me from the library, but I figured out most of it myself. Do you think it's good enough to win?" Daniel looked around at the other projects, most of which were typical elementary school efforts with obvious parental assistance, and then back at Ethan's sophisticated display. "I think you have an excellent chance, buddy. But more importantly, you should be proud of the work you put into understanding something so complex." During the judging period, Daniel found himself standing with Laura near the back of the gymnasium, watching Ethan explain his project to the panel of teachers and community volunteers. "He stayed up until 9 p.m. every night for 2 weeks working on this," Laura said quietly. "I had to force him to take breaks for dinner." Daniel smiled at this evidence of Ethan's dedication. "He reminds me of myself at that age. Once I got interested in something, I couldn't think about anything else." Laura glanced at him sideways. "Your parents must have been very patient with your obsessions." Daniel's expression darkened slightly. "My parents died when I was 12. Car accident. After that, I lived with my aunt and uncle, who were good people but didn't really understand my interests. I learned early to rely on myself for encouragement." Laura's face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I didn't know." The moment of connection between them was interrupted by an announcement that the science fair winners were being announced. Ethan's name was called for first place in the 4th grade division, and his face lit up with pure joy. He immediately looked around the room until he spotted Daniel and Laura, then ran toward them with his ribbon held high. "I won! I won! Did you see, Mr. Daniel?" The judges said my project was the most advanced they'd ever seen from someone my age. Daniel found himself swept up in a three-way hug as Ethan launched himself at both adults simultaneously, his happiness infectious and pure. For a moment, they stood there like a family, and Daniel felt a profound sense of rightness that he had never experienced before. When they separated, Daniel could see tears in Laura's eyes, though whether they were from pride, sadness, or some combination of emotions, he couldn't tell. "I'm so proud of you, buddy," Daniel said, kneeling down to Ethan's level. "This is just the beginning of all the amazing things you're going to accomplish." As they walked to the parking lot after the science fair, Ethan chattered excitedly about wanting to enter the regional science competition and maybe even build a real airplane someday. Daniel found himself making suggestions and offering encouragement with the natural ease of someone who had been part of the boy's life for years rather than weeks. Laura watched these interactions with increasing emotional complexity, and Daniel could sense that she was struggling with something important. When they reached her car, Ethan suddenly became serious. "Mr. Daniel, can I ask you something kind of personal?" Daniel nodded, curious about what was on the boy's mind. "My friend Jake's dad comes to all his school stuff and teaches him how to throw a baseball and helps him with his math homework. Do you think you could maybe do some of those things with me? I mean, if you want to, and if Mommy says it's okay?" The innocent request hit Daniel with the force of a revelation. This child, his child, was essentially asking him to be a father without using those exact words. Daniel looked at Laura and saw that she was struggling not to cry, her protective walls finally crumbling under the weight of her son's obvious need and happiness. "Ethan," Daniel said carefully, "I would be honored to help you with anything you want to learn, but that's a decision your mommy and I would need to talk about together." Ethan nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "Could you talk about it soon? Because I really like having you around, and I think Mommy does too, even though she tries to hide it." Laura's composure finally broke at her son's perceptive observation, and she turned away to wipe her eyes. Daniel felt his heart breaking for all of them, for the family they might have been, and the complicated situation they now found themselves in. That night, Laura called Daniel for the first time since their reunion. Her voice was thick with emotion when he answered. "We need to talk, Daniel, really talk, about everything." They agreed to meet the next evening after Ethan's bedtime, and Daniel spent the intervening hours trying to prepare himself for what might be his only chance to understand what had really happened 8 years ago and what possibilities might exist for the future. When Laura arrived at his apartment, she looked nervous but determined, carrying a manila envelope that she clutched like a lifeline. "Before we say anything else," she began, "you need to see this." She handed him the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a birth certificate with Ethan's full name, Ethan Daniel Rodriguez. The middle name hit Daniel like a physical blow, followed immediately by the realization that Laura had never married, had raised their son alone while carrying Daniel's name in the child's identity. "His middle name," Daniel whispered, staring at the document. "You gave him my name." Laura nodded, tears already streaming down her face. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after I left you. I was scared and angry and hurt, but I could never forget that I loved you, even when I couldn't live with you." Daniel felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Why didn't you tell me, Laura? Why did you let me spend 8 years not knowing I had a son?" Laura's composure cracked completely, and she began sobbing with the force of years of suppressed emotion. "Because I was terrified you would choose your career over him, just like you chose it over me. I couldn't bear the thought of him spending his childhood feeling like he wasn't important enough for his father's attention." The words were like knives in Daniel's heart, because he knew, deep down, that she might have been right about the man he was 8 years ago. "Laura, I know I was selfish and driven and completely focused on the wrong things," Daniel said, reaching for her hands. "But how could you make the decision for both of us? How could you rob me of the chance to know my son and rob him of the chance to know his father?" Laura pulled her hands away, her grief transforming into the anger she had been holding for nearly a decade. "Because every time something important happened in my life, You had a meeting or a deadline or a client emergency that was more important. My nursing school graduation, my birthday, the dinner where I wanted to introduce you to my parents as the man I was going to marry. You missed them all, Daniel. Every single one. Daniel felt the full weight of his past failures crushing down on him. He remembered each of those occasions, remembered the promises he had made and broken, the justifications he had given himself for prioritizing work over the woman he claimed to love. "You're right," he said quietly. "I failed you in every way that mattered. But Laura, I would never have failed him. A child changes everything. The responsibility of being a father would have changed me." Laura's laugh was bitter and heartbroken. "That's exactly what I was afraid of. That you would see him as a responsibility instead of a joy. That you would resent having to change, having to give up your precious freedom and ambition. I couldn't risk him growing up feeling like a burden to his own father." The conversation continued late into the night, 8 years of hurt and misunderstanding finally being aired between them. Daniel learned about Laura's struggles as a young single mother, working double shifts as a nurse while trying to finish her degree, living paycheck to paycheck while watching other families with 2 parents and financial stability. Laura learned about Daniel's own journey, how losing her had eventually forced him to examine his priorities, how he had slowly built a more balanced life, even as success continued to elude him in the ways that truly mattered. "I've thought about you every day for 8 years, Daniel admitted as dawn began to lighten the sky outside his apartment windows. "I convinced myself you were better off without me, that you had found someone who could love you the way you deserved. I never imagined you were raising our son alone." Laura wiped her eyes with a tissue that had long since become useless. "There were times I almost called you, especially when Ethan would ask about his father. But then I would remember how it felt to come second to everything else in your life, and I couldn't risk putting him through that." As exhausted as they both were, they knew this conversation was just the beginning of a much longer process of rebuilding trust and figuring out how to move forward. Laura had to leave to pick up Ethan from her sister's house, where he had spent the night, but before she went, she turned to Daniel with a mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. "He adores you already, Daniel. In just a few weeks, you've become his hero. Please don't break his heart. Whatever happens between us, whatever we decide about the future, promise me you won't disappear from his life again." Daniel felt the weight of that promise settle on his shoulders like a sacred trust. "I promise, Laura, I'm not going anywhere. I want to be the father he deserves, even if I have to learn how to do it from scratch." Laura nodded, seeming to find some peace in his words. "He wants to show you his bedroom, the one I turned into his airplane sanctuary. Would you like to come for dinner tomorrow night? We could start figuring out how to do this co-parenting thing." The next evening, Daniel stood outside Laura's modest apartment building with a bouquet of flowers for her and a new model airplane kit for Ethan, his hands shaking slightly with nerves. When Ethan opened the door, his face lit up with pure joy. "Mr. Daniel, Mommy said you were coming for dinner. I made spaghetti. Well, Mommy helped, but I did the stirring." Daniel laughed at the boy's enthusiasm, feeling some of his anxiety melt away. "That sounds delicious, buddy. I brought you something." When Ethan saw the airplane model, his eyes grew wide with excitement. "A P-51 Mustang. This is the hardest one I've ever seen. Will you help me build it?" Daniel knelt down to the boy's level, meeting those familiar blue eyes with a promise. "We'll build it together, piece by piece. I'll teach you everything I know about how airplanes work." Laura watched this exchange from the doorway, and Daniel could see the protective walls around her heart beginning to soften. Ethan's bedroom was a testament to his passion for aviation and his mother's love. Every surface was covered with carefully displayed model airplanes, aviation posters, and photographs of aircraft from throughout history. But what caught Daniel's attention most was a small framed picture on the nightstand, a photo of himself that must have been taken from his company website, placed next to Ethan's bed like a treasured possession. "Mommy helped me find that picture on the computer," Ethan explained, noticing Daniel's surprise. "I wanted to have a picture of the man who saved me, so I could remember what you looked like." Daniel felt his throat close with emotion. This child had been thinking about him, treasuring their brief connection with the intensity that only children could bring to relationships. Laura appeared in the doorway with tears in her eyes. "I couldn't bring myself to tell him to take it down," she said softly. "He's been looking at it every night before bed." Over dinner, Daniel listened to Ethan chatter about school and friends and his latest airplane projects, marveling at the boy's intelligence and curiosity. Every topic seemed to circle back to aviation in some way, from math problems involving flight calculations to history reports about famous pilots. "My teacher says I know more about airplanes than anyone she's ever taught," Ethan said proudly. "She wants me to give a presentation to the whole school about different types of aircraft." Daniel smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "That's a big honor, Ethan. Would you like some help preparing for it?" Ethan's face lit up. "Would you really help me? We could make it the best presentation ever." Laura watched this interaction with a complex expression, and Daniel could sense her struggle between protecting her independence and acknowledging how much Ethan craved male guidance and attention. After dinner, they began working on the model airplane together, and Daniel was struck by how naturally they fell into a rhythm of collaboration. Ethan had steady hands and remarkable patience for such a young child, carefully following Daniel's instructions while asking insightful questions about aerodynamics and engineering principles. "This is going to take us a long time to finish," Ethan observed as they sorted the tiny pieces. "Will you keep coming back to work on it with me?" Daniel looked at Laura, seeking permission before making promises. "If your mom says it's okay, I'd love to keep working on projects with you." Laura hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think that would be good for both of you." As the evening wound down, Daniel felt a contentment he had never experienced before, a sense of rightness that came from being exactly where he belonged. When it was time for Ethan's bedtime, the boy surprised Daniel by asking if he would read him a story. "Mommy usually reads to me, but tonight could you do it? I want to hear what your voice sounds like when you read." Daniel felt overwhelmed by the simple request, by this child's desire to know him in every possible way. As he read from one of Ethan's aviation-themed books, he was conscious of Laura listening from the hallway, and he wondered if she was remembering the times he used to read to her when they were together years ago. When Ethan finally drifted off to sleep, Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his son's peaceful face and feeling a protectiveness so fierce it took his breath away. This was his child, his flesh and blood, and nothing would ever be more important than ensuring his happiness and security. As Daniel prepared to leave that night, Laura walked him to the door with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I haven't seen him this happy in a long time. Whatever complicated feelings I have about our situation, I can't deny that he needs you in his life." Daniel felt a surge of gratitude mixed with determination. "Laura, I know I have a lot to prove, to both of you. I know trust isn't something I can just ask for after 8 years. But I want you to know that being Ethan's father is the most important thing I'll ever do. I won't let you down again." Laura studied his face in the dim hallway light, as if trying to see into his soul. "I want to believe that, Daniel, for his sake and maybe for mine too, but it's going to take time." Daniel nodded, understanding that rebuilding their family would require patience and consistency, not grand gestures or promises. Over the following weeks, Daniel began to establish a routine of visiting Ethan several times a week, helping with homework, working on model projects, and simply spending time together. He attended Ethan's soccer games, even though the boy was more interested in discussing the aerodynamics of kicked balls than actually playing the sport. He helped with science projects and listened to endless discussions about different aircraft specifications. Most importantly, he began to understand what it meant to put someone else's needs before his own, to find joy in simple moments of connection rather than external achievements. His business continued to function, but for the first time in his adult life, Daniel found himself leaving work at reasonable hours and declining evening meetings that would interfere with his time with Ethan. One evening, about a month into this new routine, Ethan came down with a high fever that spiked suddenly and left him feeling miserable and scared. Laura called Daniel in a panic, unsure whether to take the boy to the emergency room or wait until morning to see their regular pediatrician. "I'm coming over," Daniel said without hesitation, already grabbing his keys. "We'll figure it out together." When he arrived at Laura's apartment, he found Ethan curled up on the couch, flushed with fever and whimpering softly. Laura was hovering nearby, checking his temperature every few minutes and clearly fighting her own panic. "His fever hit 103 about an hour ago," she said, her nursing training warring with her maternal fear. "I gave him medication, but I'm worried it's not working fast enough." Daniel knelt beside the couch and gently placed his hand on Ethan's forehead, feeling the heat radiating from the small body. "Hey, buddy, how are you feeling?" Ethan opened his eyes and managed a weak smile. "Not so good, Mr. Daniel. My head hurts, and I feel hot and cold at the same time." Daniel looked at Laura with concern. "What does your nursing experience tell you?" Laura took a shaky breath. "Probably just a virus, but the spike was so sudden, and he's never been this sick before. I think we should take him to the pediatric emergency room, just to be safe." Daniel nodded immediately. "Let's go. I'll drive." As they bundled Ethan in blankets and headed to the hospital, Daniel found himself praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years, begging for his son to be okay, promising anything in exchange for the boy's health and happiness. The emergency room visit stretched into the early hours of the morning, with blood tests and monitoring, and the slow, terrible wait for results. Ethan dozed fitfully between procedures, and when he was awake, he clung to Daniel's hand with surprising strength. "Are you going to stay with me?" Ethan asked during one lucid moment. "Even if I have to stay in the hospital?" Daniel felt his heart break at the fear in his son's voice. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy. Your mom and I will both stay right here with you until you're feeling better." Laura watched this interaction with tears in her eyes, and Daniel realized that she was seeing him truly prioritize their child's well-being over everything else for the first time. When the doctor finally came back with results confirming a viral infection that would run its course with rest and medication, the relief in the room was palpable. As they drove home in the dawn light, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, his fever finally breaking. Laura reached over and squeezed Daniel's hand. "Thank you for being here tonight. I don't think I could have handled this alone." Daniel squeezed back gently. "You're not alone anymore, Laura. Whatever happens between us, you'll never have to handle anything alone again." When they arrived back at the apartment, Daniel carried a still sleeping Ethan to his bedroom and tucked him in carefully, sitting beside the bed to watch him breathe peacefully. Laura appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching over their son as the morning light filled the room. "He called you Daddy while he was half asleep in the hospital," Laura said quietly. "Did you hear that?" Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak for a moment. "I heard. It was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard in my life." Laura leaned against his shoulder, and for the first time since their reunion, Daniel felt like they might actually be able to build something together, not just for Ethan's sake, but for their own healing as well. "I've been thinking," Laura said softly, "about what you said about trust taking time. Maybe we don't have to figure everything out all at once. Maybe we can just take it one day at a time and see what develops naturally." Daniel felt hope bloom in his chest, carefully tentative but growing stronger. "I'd like that very much. I want to earn your trust back, Laura, and I want to be the father Ethan deserves. But most of all, I want us to be a family, however that ends up looking." 1 year later, Daniel stood in the living room of the house he now shared with Laura and Ethan, watching his son carefully pack a small suitcase for his first overnight trip to aviation camp. The boy had grown taller over the past year, more confident and happy, secure in the knowledge that he had 2 parents who loved him unconditionally. "Don't forget your camera, Ethan," Laura called from the kitchen, where she was packing lunch for the drive to the airport. "And remember to call us every night before lights out." Ethan rolled his eyes with the dramatic flair of a 9-year-old. "Mommy, I'll be fine. Besides, Daddy taught me everything I need to know about airplanes, and you taught me everything I need to know about taking care of myself." Daniel smiled at being called Daddy so naturally, a title he had earned through consistency and love rather than biology alone. The drive to the airport was filled with Ethan's excited chatter about the activities planned for camp, flight simulators, meetings with real pilots, and the chance to see inside a commercial aircraft maintenance hangar. As they pulled into the departure area, Daniel reflected on the irony of returning to the place where their story had begun, where missing a flight had led to finding his family. "Are you nervous at all, buddy?" Daniel asked, as they helped Ethan check in for his flight. "A little," Ethan admitted, "but mostly excited. And I know you and Mommy will be here when I get back." Laura knelt down to give Ethan a final hug, her eyes bright with pride and just a touch of maternal worry. "Have the most amazing time, sweetheart. Learn everything you can and make new friends." As they watched Ethan's plane taxi down the runway, Daniel put his arm around Laura and felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. They had built something beautiful together, a family founded on second chances and hard-won trust, strengthened by shared love for an extraordinary child who had brought them all together. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't missed that flight?" Laura asked, leaning into his embrace. Daniel smiled, thinking about the man he had been a year ago, driven and lonely, measuring his worth by external achievements rather than the love he could give and receive. "I used to think missing that flight was the worst thing that could have happened to me," he said, watching Ethan's plane disappear into the cloudy Chicago sky. "But now I know it was the moment my real life finally began. I thought I was missing a flight, but what I was really doing was catching the rest of my life."